All right. Hello, hello. So, we are going to now look at a new chapter today, looking at chapter 24, the digestive system. So, all about food. So, this is the first part we're going to be looking at in here today, and then eventually we'll look at part 2 of the digestive system. So, here's a great question to start off today with, right? How long is your GI tract? So starting from your mouth and going all the way down to your anus, how long is your GI tract? Any ideas? Well, if you're curious, maybe you know the answer, maybe you don't. The length is 30 feet. 30 feet. That is how long your GI tract is. 30 feet in length. And most of that length is from your small intestine and the colon. So there are a variety of different organs that make up the GI tract. And the ones that I have here indicated in the red are major organs of the GI tract, and they're considered to be part of the alimentary canal. So the alimentary canal, GI tract, these organs are important for digestion of the food and absorption of the food. And the food actually is traveling through these various organs. So that's the case with starting initially with the mouth, the oral cavity, and the throat, so the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, large intestine, and eventually then the food will leave out through your anus. So all of these here in the red make up the alimentary canal. And this is, again, a fancy term for the GI tract. All right, so what we have here is a really cool movie, and this takes you literally through the GI tract. And so literally, you're like traveling within your digestive system, this movie. So there's no commentary to this other than me. And so we'll just take a look and see how this works here for y'all. All right, so starting off here, we are making our way through the GI tract, 30 feet long. And we start here in the commentary. We're traveling through your esophagus. The food at this point would be known as a bolus. And slowly but surely, we're eventually going to make our way through the cardiac sphincter, the lower esophageal sphincter. And here we are now in the stomach. So the stomach, there's lots of wrinkles through here called the rugae. We might see some chyme in here maybe eventually, maybe some gastric juice. So there's some chyme, some gastric juice there. So partially digested food. There's a lot of chyme in the green there that you're seeing. And we make our way through the stomach, and now we're eventually going to leave, going out through the pyloric sphincter, and now we have entered into the small intestine, the first section called the duodenum. So there's going to be circular folds, some secreting of bile, and a little bit of, there's the bile in the green, and you would have saw that bicarbonate juice going in. And we'll see a lot of partially digested food here. A lot of nutrient absorption is going to occur in the small intestine. So we're making our way through the duodenum into the jejunum here. Very twisted, coiled part here. More partially digested food. The green chyme indicates that. And eventually we'll make our way then into the ileum, the last section here. So it's quite a length here. Approximately this is about 20 feet here. And eventually we're going to get to the end of the ileum and enter into the large intestine. We're going to go through the ileocecal valve, Here we are, we're going right through it. And now we're right into the colon. The cecum is the first section of the large intestine, and we're now going to slowly make our way up the ascending colon here. And a lot of nutrients have been reabsorbed. We're seeing a little bit of conversion of partially digested food. A lot of water reabsorption will occur here, along with electrolytes and vitamins. And you get to the end of the large intestine, and it's looking like feces when you get to the sigmoid colon. Very soon now, we're going to be going past the rectal valves into the rectum. So we have the feces in here in the rectum. We'll probably come up to it eventually as we're slowly creeping and making our way to the anal canal. And here we are in the anal canal. So you have two sphincters that help with defecation to get rid of our feces, our internal anal sphincter and external anal sphincter. So they're at work here through defecation to release the feces, items that can't be digested at all, no nutrient value, and boom, out through the anus. 30 feet in length. So I hope you enjoyed that video. Definitely take a look at it. And yeah, gives you an idea of what we're going to cover in here today. Here's another video that you can take a look at. I'm not going to do any commentary to it, but feel free to take a look. This is about the pathway of food through the GI tract. This was put together by University of Michigan Health System, and I think you'll enjoy it. So go ahead and take a look at that. Kind of a nice preview of a lot of the important terms that we're going to be covering here today in class. All right. So we've gone through organs already that are defined as the alimentary canal, and those are organs like the stomach that food actually travels through. This slide here, however, is focusing in on the various organs in the GI tract that are defined as accessory digestive organs. So accessory digestive organs. Those are going to be organs where food doesn't necessarily travel through them per se, but they're contributing something to help to break down the food. So they might be secreting digestive enzymes to help to catabolically break down the food. So they're going to be helping in some way or another. So some of these accessory digestive organs, the tongue and the teeth, they're more about all about ultimately breaking down the food initially. The salivary glands, they're important because of the release of saliva, mixing with the food to form bolus, and because of the variety of digestive enzymes that are released here to help to start to break down fat and to also help to start to break down carbohydrates. The pancreas is another accessory digestive organ. It's contributing by the release of bicarbonate juice into the duodenum to help neutralize the chyme. And there's a lot of digestive enzymes produced there too to help to break down protein, fat, carbohydrates, even nucleic acids. The liver, so the liver here, this is the location where bile is going to be produced. And the gallbladder ultimately is important because this is the storage tank for bile. And bile is a green substance that ultimately helps as an emulsifier with fats to help prep the fat to eventually go through nutrient absorption. And we'll get into more details with these structures as we go through our lecture in here today, and definitely into part 2 of the digestive system as well. We're now going to take a look at the overall GI tract functions. And there are several different functions that we're going to discuss in here today. The first one up here at the top is looking at what's known as ingestion. And that's ultimately all about taking the food and putting it into your mouth. So taking that piece of pizza, that chocolate chip cookie, and going ahead and actually putting it into your mouth. And that's that initial part of the digestive system, is the idea of ingestion. Another critical part of the GI tract when it comes to functioning is the mechanical digestion idea. And this is ultimately preparing the food for chemical digestion through the work of digestive enzymes. And this happens early on in the mouth when it comes to chewing, the overall strong churning in the stomach, and even segmentation, which occurs in the small intestine. So that's another function, is mechanical digestion. Another important function that we can see here is known as the chemical digestion. We've just went over mechanical digestion, but now chemical. So the chemical digestion is important for the overall breakdown catabolically of complex foods. Breaking down of items you would have for dinner, like a baked potato. And this idea that this is happening in many different organs along the way. So this process is taking place in the stomach, chemical digestion. You certainly have that going on in the small intestine. So there's different places where this is taking place. Another important function of the digestive system is this idea of propulsion. Propulsion. And this is simply the idea of moving something along. In this case, we're moving food along. When we look at the idea of swallowing, that would be voluntary. That's the voluntary process of propulsion. You have the control if you want to swallow your food or not. And most cases we do. But sometimes you might have food where maybe that piece of steak is a little too big. It's like, oh, I don't know, I might choke on it. And then you spit it out, right? The other important part of propulsion is peristalsis. Okay? So peristalsis is the other branch of propulsion. This is considered to be an involuntary process. And this occurs from the esophagus all the way down to the large intestine. And we don't have any conscious control over this. This process is just going to occur to propel the food, and this happens because of the overall muscle lining in the GI tract, smooth muscle lining, and you have contraction and relaxation of the muscles, and that ultimately then leads to propelling the food from one organ to another. Another important function is the idea of absorption. This is referring to nutrient absorption, and this is primarily occurring in the small intestine, and the food is being absorbed into blood vessels nearby, lymph vessels if we're talking about fat, but proteins and carbohydrates and nucleic acids are being absorbed into blood vessels nearby. So that's the idea of nutrient absorption. And then the last important function we see indicated here is defecation. And this is all about elimination of those indigestible substances. And so defecation, the item is in the anal canal, and then we go ahead and through the sphincters, we defecate out the feces through the anus. So these are all very important functions to be aware of, to know when it comes to knowing what's happening in your digestive system. This picture here is illustrating two major processes of movement of food. So we've already talked about peristalsis, but now we're going to look at it in a little bit more detail. So peristalsis is occurring in your esophagus, in your stomach, in your small intestine, and in your large intestine. And it's all about the food being propelled down the organ. So imagine this structure here, kind of in the orange, would represent maybe the esophagus. This structure here in the brown, it looks like an egg, but let's say it's food. Okay, maybe this is the bolus. And the orange here would be the muscle lining of that organ, the esophagus, where you have the contraction and relaxation of that smooth muscle that ultimately is propelling the food right here, so that bolus, down the esophagus, eventually to the stomach. So peristalsis, again, we have no conscious control over this, occurs in a variety of different locations along the GI tract. The other very important process to be aware of is what's known as segmentation. Segmentation only occurs in the small intestine. And how this process works, and we can see this over here looking at picture letter B. So here we have that partially digested food here in the small intestine, and ultimately the lining of the small intestine, the muscles, are undergoing contraction, relaxation, and ultimately moving that food forwards and backwards, almost like a washing machine when you wash your clothes. The food mixing that's occurring here is important. It slows down the movement of the food temporarily. So that's important when it comes to proper nutrient absorption. And so that's really key here, to have enough time for nutrient absorption. And so the overall proportion of the movement of the food here is slowed down. And segmentation allows that to be so, to slow down the propulsion of the food. So just be aware of peristalsis and segmentation. Be aware of where these processes take place. We're now going to look more at the connection of the GI tract to the brain, because there is some neurological control and nerves that are connected from the GI tract to the brain. So this overall connection to hunger and the GI tract prepping for food through nerves connected to the brain, it all starts with stimuli. All right, stimuli. So, external stimuli. You have a variety of different things that can go ahead and trigger that central nervous system to get triggering the idea that you're hungry and you need food. Sometimes it can be simply the sight of food, that you go ahead and you see that chocolate chip donut. You see the pink sprinkle donut right here and thinking, I'm getting hungry. I need to eat, right? It's time to eat. It's time to eat. And you see it and you're getting hungry and hungry and hungrier. But it's not only that. Other external stimuli, the smell of it. You're smelling the donuts. Maybe your favorite place to go for donuts in the fall is Baines. Baines is a great place to go in town locally. They have delicious donuts. So maybe you enjoy those, or maybe it's summertime and summer, maybe you just love that fresh watermelon or steak on the grill or brats or whatever it might be, and the smell of the grill. And then, of course, you taste the food. Once you taste it, you know how it goes. It's all over. You eventually go ahead and you eat a couple brats or those homemade cookies from Grandma around the holidays. You have one cookie, before you know it, you eat all the cookies. The whole container's gone. And then just thinking of the food more and more and more. And that ultimately then leads to, right, the stimuli connected through nerves through the central nervous system up to the brain. So here's a great question to ask when the stimuli is triggered up to the brain. Well, what part of the brain actually controls hunger? What part of the brain controls hunger? Any ideas, guys? What part of the brain controls hunger? Okay. So you're probably wondering, well, what is it, Chris? What is it? Maybe you know the answer, though. It's a very small structure in the brain. It starts with an H, and you're probably thinking, oh, I got it now, right? It's the hypothalamus, isn't it? The hypothalamus is ultimately what is controlling that hunger. Okay? So the hypothalamus is ultimately what's controlling that hunger here. Okay, the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is ultimately what's going to be controlling that hunger. And then you have a very important nerve here that is actually connected to the gut of the GI tract, the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve. And so this vagus nerve is connected right to the gut and is leading to impulses connected to the gut. And ultimately, that connection can play a big role with prepping the gut for the process of digestion. Now, another important thing to consider here also is the question I have down here at the bottom. Well, what autonomic nervous system stimulates the GI tract function? Any ideas? Remember, there's two branches to the autonomic nervous system. So it's either going to be the sympathetic nervous system, the SNS, or it's going to be the parasympathetic nervous system, the PNS. So it's a 50-50 here for this question. So what's really going to stimulate that GI tract functioning? That is going to be the work of the PNS. So our parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system. So parasympathetic nervous system. So ran out of room there, but short term abbreviation PNS. Okay, PNS. Parasympathetic nervous system. And we can fix this here for you. There you go. Parasympathetic nervous system there. Now, a big emphasis so far I've highlighted is the external stimuli, but of course there's internal stimuli too. And so this also can play a role along with the external stimuli and can really prep the smooth muscle and glands associated. Let's think for the stomach here for a moment. So the stomach is already preparing for food to go into it, even before you even put a piece of food into your mouth. And you start having noises coming from your stomach, the gurgling. And that's a lot of release of gastric juice, okay? And that release of gastric juice, all that's controlled by hormones. There's a lot of hormones that play a significant role with digestion throughout the GI tract. But in the stomach, what's playing a big role with the release of the gastric juice, which contains the hydrochloric acid, is the hormone known as gastrin. And we'll talk about that a little later, but I'll write it down here for you, but the hormone gastrin. So gastrin, Gastrin. So that's being triggered because of the stimuli connected here to the nervous system. And this is leading to the release of a lot of gastric juice containing hydrochloric acid to prep the stomach for the food that's going to enter in. And gastrin is controlled, ultimately. This is all going to be controlled and leads to a release of hydrochloric acid, and that's the purpose of the hormone. Okay, so this is going to be secreted in high amounts here. This hormone is triggered to release hydrochloric acid, and this is all controlled by the nervous system, especially the parasympathetic nervous system through the vagus nerve. That's the stimulation. Okay, so those are some early things to think about, this connection between the brain and the gut. when it comes to hunger, when it comes to digestion. So that plays a significant role. All right, the next thing we're going to take a look at here today, that's very important with the digestive system, is looking at the alimentary canal. And when we look at the alimentary canal, there are 4 basic tunic wall layers that you need to know, okay? 4 basic tunic wall layers of the alimentary canal, the gut. Pretty much focusing in on the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine. So we'll take a look at these layers, and it's also important to know the functions of them as well. So our first tunic wall layer that we're going to look at in here today is the mucosa. Okay, the mucosa. So the mucosa is important functionally because it secretes mucus along with digestive enzymes and hormones. It is the innermost wall layer. Okay, the innermost wall layer of the gut. So right here, this is the mucosa layer right here. Okay, this is the mucosa layer. Right in the middle here is the lumen. That's where food actually travels through in the organ. But this is the innermost wall layer right here, known as the mucosa. The next wall layer that's very important to know, number 2, is the submucosa. The submucosa. The submucosa contains blood and lymphatic vessels, lymphoid follicles, nerve endings. So the pyrus patches from the lymphatic system would be found here. And we can see that on the diagram here as well. So the submucosa, that would be right here. Okay, this is the submucosa. So you can see the blood vessels here, nerves, lymphatic vessels, etc. right here. So number 2, submucosa. Okay, and now we have our 2 other layers to know. So number 3, the tunic basic wall layers. Number 3, muscularis externa. Muscularis externa. So here's our third tunic wall layer. This is the muscle layer. It's responsible for segmentation and peristalsis to take place. It also has nerves here through the autonomic nervous system controls. This is going to be a pretty thick layer of 3 layers of muscle that are made up of smooth muscle. And we can see that right here. So here we have that muscularis externa layer. So there's the longitudinal muscle, the circular muscle right here. So I mentioned 3 layers, but that's the case in the stomach. But we're talking the esophagus or the smooth or the small intestine or the large intestine. Those organs just have 2 layers here of smooth muscle. The stomach has 3 because of the strong, vigorous peristalsis and churning that occurs of food in the stomach. So that's number 3, muscularis externa. And then number 4, our last tunic wall layer, serosa. And the serosa is important when it comes to protection of the gut. It's the most outside layer, more of a thin sheath really. And we'll show you that on the picture here too. So over here would be the serosa. Okay, serosa and serosa. Okay, so definitely make sure to know your 4 basic tunic wall layers of the gut. Make sure to know those and the functions. We're now going to start this process of the overall traveling of the food through the GI tract. So imagine that you've put the food into your mouth in the oral cavity. And when you're doing that, then ultimately you're mixing the food through chewing. And the fancy term for chewing is known as mastication. So mastication, chewing, a mechanical process. This is all taking place right in the oral cavity. And ultimately, this leads to the forming of what's known as bolus. Okay, the bolus. So simply here in the oral cavity then, the food is converted converted to bolus. This is pretty much a compacted mass of food, the bolus. And this food, again, is compacted because of mastication, chewing, the significant amount of saliva released from the salivary glands to ultimately form this bolus. So imagine that in the mouth here. This is a picture of the tongue here, of course, and the various papillae here that ultimately assist with playing a role with eating as well in mastication. Some of these papillae, such as the filiform papillae, ultimately play a role when it comes to eating ice cream. So, now we take a look at the saliva. So looking at the saliva, and this saliva ultimately is being produced in salivary glands. There are 3 major salivary glands that are going to be producing saliva. So majority of the saliva produced by these glands here. We have the sublingual gland that is situated right below the tongue. We have the submandibular gland as well. So that's going to be down along the lower jawbone there, the mandible. And then we have the parotid gland, which is going to be kind of right near the ear. You may be thinking, well, what ultimately makes up the saliva composition? What's really in saliva? Have you ever thought about that? Maybe it's just me, but maybe you have. A good proportion of saliva is water. As you can see here, very high percentage of water. And there's also electrolytes that are found in the saliva as well, like sodium and potassium and chloride. And then number 3, there are digestive enzymes here. 2 of them here. We have the salivary amylase and lingual lipase. So, already in your oral cavity, you're already starting to have the catabolic breakdown of your food. So when we're looking at salivary amylase, I'll pick on this one first here. So salivary amylase, obviously salivary is referring to the salivary glands here. So salivary amylase, so AMYLASE, salivary amylase ultimately is starting to break down carbohydrates, your carbs. Okay, so I'm just writing carbs, but it starts to break down carbohydrates. Anytime you have an enzyme that ends with amylase, you know you're breaking down carbohydrates. So you're starting to break down those complex carbohydrates, polysaccharides, starting to catabolically break them down into disaccharides. And then, of course, disaccharides eventually become monosaccharides, which are simple sugars. Simple sugars, the building blocks of carbohydrates. The other very important enzyme, I'm going to erase this here now. The other important enzyme produced here is the lingual lipase. So lingual lipase. Lingual lipase is going to start the breakdown of your fats. So we're already starting to break fat down in the oral cavity here. So you're already starting to break down your fats, or better known as triglycerides or lipids. So you're already starting to break down these triglycerides. And over time, then the fats, the triglycerides are broken down, and eventually you get to their building blocks, which would be fatty acids and glycerol. So you see an enzyme that ends with lipase, you know that you're breaking down fats. That's the code name per se. Amylase, that's kind of a code name to breaking down carbohydrates. Lipase, it's kind of a code name for breaking down fats. So that's pretty important. That's a major function of what's in the saliva. When it comes to the function of the saliva is the fact that it has digestive enzymes to start catabolically breaking down your food. And then another important function of the salivary glands having saliva, what's in the saliva, is the idea of the immune system. You have antibody AGA that's going to be found in that saliva there. Okay, so some protection against microbes that ultimately that might be encountered. So that's what's in the composition of saliva. Functions, we've kind of already talked about this idea, cleansing the mouth, again, a minor one. But dissolving food chemicals, aids with bolus formation, breakdown of starch with amylase, and of course lipase breaking down fat. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the teeth in the oral cavity. So there are two major types of teeth here that you're going to find. We have our deciduous teeth and our permanent teeth. So the deciduous teeth, there are 20 of those, typically speaking. Those are considered our baby teeth. Deciduous, well, just like a tree losing leaves, here we're going to lose our teeth here. What we're seeing here in the diagram, ultimately, is kind of a range of when these teeth form. And eventually they'll all fall out around age 12, sometimes a little later. I lost my last molar, I believe, when I was 14 or 15. So it can vary a little bit with timing. And then what happens in return is the idea that the permanent teeth come in. There are 32 permanent teeth that we have ultimately, okay, in your mouth. Most people have 32, not everybody. Not everybody has wisdom teeth. But this gives you over here, again, kind of a breakdown approximately when these teeth come in. And the wisdom teeth usually are the last ones to come in. So some people might be not until their early to mid-20s before they come in. And then you may not have room for the wisdom teeth, so then you have to have them removed. So I didn't have room in my mouth. I had to get all four of mine out when I was in my early 20s. So I had to have those removed, and that's always fun. And then, you know, you have the holes in the back you got to clean out and take care of. And they're always like, make sure to wash them out, those holes, because you don't want a dry socket. And a dry socket ultimately comes about severe inflammation in the back of the jaw here because the area got infected. And that definitely can happen if you don't properly clean that area out. And sometimes with surgery, infections can occur. But some people have enough room in their mouth that they can hold on to their wisdom teeth. It really varies from one person to the next. We're now going to take a look at the classes of teeth. So we have incisors, canines, and premolars, known as bicuspids, and finally molars. 4 different types of teeth based off of classifications. Incisors are always on the front. They are chisel-shaped. They're important for cutting or nipping off pieces of food. They're, of course, the ones you see when it's time for the family photo. Cheese! And then the canines are a little farther back. They're fang-like. Obviously not as pronounced in a dog, right? But they are important for tearing and overall piercing of food. A little farther back we have the premolars and the molars. And they have pretty broad crowns with rounded cusp for grinding and crushing that food. And you can see in that picture, you can see them there, right? Here's the premolar, the molars back there, and they're so far back, sometimes those areas are prone to cavities. We now take a look at the anatomy of the canine tooth. 3 major regions we'll have of the tooth. There's the crown region, so that's the exposed part of the tooth. We have the neck, which is right where the gum line would be, so the gingiva. And then the portion of the tooth actually within the jawbone is the root. Those are regions: crown, neck, and root. Then there's various structures that make up the tooth. So we look at these structures. The outermost structure that's white is known as enamel. It is made up of calcium salts and mineral crystals. The next layer is the dentin. So this is a protein-rich, bone-like material, forms the bulk of the tooth, and acts as a shock absorber. In this picture, you can see that here. This is the blue here, represents the dentin. And then right in the middle right here, we have the pulp cavity. Okay, the pulp cavity. So the pulp cavity, and there you're going to have blood vessels, nerves within the pulp cavity. Farther down, you'd have the root canal. So those are some of the major functions here. There's other ones here too. You can see the cementum, the periodontal ligament, which can anchor the tooth to the jaw. So this gives you an idea here, ultimately. Maybe you're like this, just like me. You know, you go and get your monthly checkup from the dentist. And I remember one time they're looking in the back of my mouth, and they're like, ooh, that one molar in the back is really getting degraded. That enamel's nearly gone. You're almost down to dentin. And they're like, well, the reason for that, Chris, is because you grind your teeth at night. So after that, they had to develop my mouthpiece to wear at night. So that way I'm not degrading my enamel or dentin more in the molars in the back with the way I grind my teeth, I guess. So now that helps a lot, because sometimes, you know, it's like, oh, I forgot several days to put it in, and it's like, oh, my teeth kind of hurt. Well, that might be that reason for sure. All right, we're now going to talk about cavities. So cavities, defined as gradual demineralization of the enamel and the dentin. And this can occur over time. Some of the major causes for cavity development is because of plaque buildup, which can be the result of sugar. So someone that likes to drink a lot of sugary drinks, they like their Mountain Dew, they like their Coca-Cola, they like their Pepsi, right? They drink lots of Gatorade. Anything with sugar can really lead to this. Candy. All that debris and bacteria. So hence, it's important to brush those teeth. You should be brushing your teeth several times a day. So someone that doesn't brush their teeth, or not very often, can really increase their chances of cavity development. And that acid from the bacteria can dissolve the calcium salts in the enamel layer from the teeth. And you get down to dentin, and then you end up with a hole. So brush those teeth like I mentioned. Very key. But flossing too. So some people don't do enough flossing. They don't do it at all. And flossing is also very key. You should be doing that several times a day. Of course, when you go to the dentist, you go ahead and you get your x-ray performed. And in this image here, you can see that this orange area here, ultimately the dental cavity is seen in that orange area, right? And so, again, sometimes you get that news. Of course, you know, the x-rays are always tough. I always hated getting those x-rays when I was a kid, and even now, you know, and it's always tough for me. I start gagging and stuff. It just, you know, hold on to the little, you know, little splint here, right? Hold on. All right, we'll take the picture, and it's just tough. So, have you ever had a cavity? That's something to think about. Have you? A lot of people, I'm sure, have, but maybe you haven't. I've been fortunate. I've never had a cavity before. Maybe you haven't either. There are reasons for that. Genetics plays a big role. So sometimes with some people's genetics, they never have a cavity. Like my grandfather never had a cavity his whole life. And that was even before toothpaste even had fluoride in it. So genetics can play a big role, especially your diet. If you're not drinking a lot of pop and eating a lot of candy, that can play a big role too. All right, we move on. We leave the teeth. And now we're going to talk about the esophagus. The esophagus. Okay? So imagine that the food went through the oral cavity, went into the pharynx. So, of course, that would be the oropharynx. And then the food went into the laryngopharynx. And now we're at a point that the food is going to slip into the esophagus. The esophagus is roughly 10 inches long, and there are two sphincters that are going to regulate the movement of the food through the esophagus. So there's an upper and lower esophageal sphincter. An upper and lower esophageal sphincter. The upper esophageal sphincter is going to regulate food movement from the laryngeal pharynx into the esophagus, and the lower esophageal sphincter will control overall regulation of food from the esophagus into the stomach. And you can see there's other names this sphincter goes by, that lower esophageal sphincter, such as cardiac, you've heard that term before, I'm sure, cardiac sphincter, or even the gastroesophageal sphincter. Of course, there's tunic wall layers in the esophagus. So we have our mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa. The only difference here for naming is instead of serosa, it's adventitia for the esophagus. We're now going to take a look at a little bit of physiology here when it comes to the act of swallowing. And the fancy term for this is known as deglutition. Deglutition. So that's the fancy word for swallowing, deglutition. There are three major phases to deglutition, which are important to know. Phase 1 of deglutition is defined as the buccal phase. The buccal phase. This is considered to be a voluntary process occurring in that oral cavity, and ultimately the contracting of the tongue occurs. This food is put up against the hard palate, soft palate, goes past the uvula, and eventually slips into the pharynx. Which brings us to phase number 2, the pharyngeal phase. The pharyngeal phase ultimately is occurring in the pharynx, in the oropharynx, and the laryngeal pharynx. It's an involuntary process here, so we really have no conscious control over this process as the food's going down your throat. And then phase 3 is known as the esophageal phase. So the esophageal phase is ultimately occurring in the esophagus, okay? And again, no conscious control here. The process of peristalsis will propel the food through the esophagus, and eventually at the end, the food will slip into the stomach. Here we take a look with these pictures of the step-by-step process that we have here of deglutition again. So we'll look at this step-by-step here. All right, so this first picture here is illustrating the food. So that bolus is in the oral cavity. And early on, the upper esophageal sphincter is contracting here. This is ultimately looking at the buccal phase. So remember previously we talked about the buccal phase. Buccal phase, right? The bolus in the oral cavity. The tongue here ultimately is pressing up against the hard palate, okay? And that will force that bolus to go ahead, make its way past then the soft palate, uvula, and slip into the throat, right into the oropharynx. The second picture here of deglutition now, we've already looked at the buccal phase. That number 1 there was buccal phase. Number 2 here now, we are looking at that pharyngeal phase. Here's the bolus here, the uvula here, and ultimately the epiglottis will close. So that's important here. We don't want the bolus to slip into the respiratory system. And of course, with the uvula closing, we don't want the bolus to go up into the nasal cavities either. So that's very important. The upper esophageal sphincter is going to start relaxing, which will allow for the bolus to enter into the esophagus. So very important here that that uvula closes off. Sometimes some people are eating and maybe it's a really big sneeze or whatever it might be, okay? And sometimes that uvula doesn't close all the way and that food can slip into the nasal cavity and the food can actually come out through your nose. I've seen that before with little kids where scrambled eggs come out of their nose, or chocolate milk comes out of their nose, because of the fact that they're going ahead and they're eating. Maybe they're talking. They take a big sneeze, perhaps, right? And all of a sudden, there you have it. And then looking here, this is phase 3 now. The bolus has slipped into the esophagus. So this is the esophageal phase now. Starting off, the upper esophageal sphincter relaxed, which allowed the bolus to come in. And then ultimately, that upper esophageal sphincter contracts. It closes off after the bolus is in. Here we can see down here, the esophageal phase continues. This is the esophagus here. The smooth muscle, again, is undergoing contraction, relaxation, and then the food is moving, being propelled through that process of peristalsis, and eventually will make its way down to that lower esophageal sphincter, okay, like here. And that lower esophageal sphincter, or cardiac sphincter, or gastroesophageal sphincter opens up, and now the bolus enters into the stomach. So this gives you a nice picture perspective of this process of deglutition. And again, very important for you to know this process of deglutition. This is a video here that you can take a look at if you'd like. I strongly recommend it. It does a great job of going through deglutition. There's good commentary along. So definitely take a look at that. That can definitely help you with a further understanding of this physiological process of deglutition. All right, so it's now time to review. So hopefully you have some of this initial stuff down when it comes to the digestive system. And our first question today for review, number 1, which of the following are accessory digestive organs? Which of the following are accessory digestive organs? So, what would be the correct answer here? And the correct answer that I would go with, how about choice letter E? Choice letter E. Both A, B, and C would be correct. Number 2 for review. Peristalsis occurs in the blank. Peristalsis occurs in the blank. So what would be the correct answer for number 2? All right. And the correct answer here I would go with, how about choice letter E? Both A, B, and C would be correct. Both A, B, and C would be correct. Letter E. Number 3 for review. The blank is a tunic wall layer in the alimentary canal that is responsible for segmentation and peristalsis along with autonomic nervous system control of the gut. So what tunic wall layer are we talking about here? What would be the correct answer? All right, and the correct answer that I would go with, how about choice letter C? Choice letter C, muscularis externa is the correct answer. Number 4 for review. The salivary glands produce the enzyme blank, which breaks down starch. So what would be the correct answer here? All right. The correct answer that I would go with here, how about choice letter C? Letter C, salivary amylase. Salivary amylase. Remember, amylase refers to breaking down carbohydrates. And starch right here, well, that's a polysaccharide. So, salivary amylase is breaking down carbohydrates, and of course, first breaking down those complex carbohydrates, such as starch, breaking it down into a disaccharide. Number 5 for review. During the blank, the tongue presses up against the hard palate, forcing the bolus into the oropharynx. This phase is also voluntary and occurs in the oral cavity. Which phase of deglutition are we talking about here? All right, and the correct answer that I would go with, how about choice letter A, the buccal phase? The buccal phase. So that would be the correct answer here for number 5. All right, moving on. So the bolus now has entered into the stomach. So now we're going to talk about the stomach in some detail. The stomach is defined as your temporary storage tank. You can hold about a gallon of food there if you want. And when the bolus enters into the stomach, eventually this is going to be converted into what's known as chyme. So the bolus has become chyme. Okay? So the chyme here is a creamy type of paste of partially digested food. And it's partially digested food because we've already started to break down fats up in the oral cavity. We've already started breaking down of carbohydrates already up in the oral cavity. And in the stomach, as we'll see here, we're going to start to break down proteins here too because of the enzyme pepsin, and further break down our fats here through the use of the enzyme gastric lipase. And likewise, gastric juice released here too. That forms the chyme. And that's the picture down here of the chyme. Does that look lovely? You're probably thinking, oh, this is great. Or maybe you're thinking, oh, this chyme is really gross and disgusting. Ugh. Well, we've definitely seen this before. Anyone who's gotten sick and, vomit or whatever, right? Well, that's the chyme. Real lovely, great smell. Looking lovely, maybe a little bit of green perhaps, right? And of course, with the gastric juice, hydrochloric acid, the pH is real low of that. So real lovely smell, I know. Yeah, lovely. The movement of the bolus into the stomach is regulated by 2 major sphincters. We've mentioned the one that's up here, right? That was that cardiac sphincter that we talked about, right? Cardiac sphincter. Doesn't indicate it here, but cardiac sphincter in the cardia region. So that's that cardiac sphincter up here. Right? Cardiac sphincter. Connection of the esophagus to the stomach. And then down here, we have the pyloric sphincter. Pyloric sphincter. That regulates the movement of the chyme out of the stomach and eventually into the small intestine, into the duodenum. Right here. There are also these ridges in the stomach known as the rugae, and these are very large longitudinal folds. So they're ultimately going to be there when there's emptying of the stomach, but when food comes in, eventually they go away as the stomach expands with an increase in food in the stomach. So you're probably wondering, whoa, where are we going here, Chris? We're now going to look at the lining of the stomach. And if we look at the lining of the stomach, especially within the innermost wall layer of the stomach, known as the mucosa, you're going to find a variety of different items here. So we have what's known as gastric pits, and these gastric pits are holes that we can see up here on the top. So gastric pits, and this is important, the gastric pits, because these holes allow for hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes ultimately to leave here along with hormones to go ahead and leave the gastric glands. So this is the gastric glands of the mucosa. And these are a variety of different cell types. And when these items are released from these cell types in the gastric gland, the various components go up through the gastric pits and enter into the lumen of the stomach. You have a variety of different types of cells then that make up the gastric gland. We have the mucous neck cells, and we're not really totally sure what the functions of those are, other than we know they secrete mucus, and we're not entirely sure about anything else at this time. But there's also parietal cells, and there's also chief cells, and there's also these enteroendocrine cells. So a variety of different cells types here that have very unique functions in the stomach. And again, when their contents are released, they can travel up through the gastric gland and out through the gastric pits into the stomach. So now we're going to view the gastric gland here next. So here's a picture of these various cells in the gastric gland. The ones in the blue here represents the parietal cell. Okay, so here we have a parietal cell. Here we have a parietal cell in the blue. The functions of the parietal cells is that they produce hydrochloric acid. HCl is just an abbreviation for that long term, hydrochloric acid. So that's a very strong acid, hydrochloric acid, with a pH of 1. And parietal cells also produce what's known as the intrinsic factor. The intrinsic factor. And that's important when it comes to vitamin B12 absorption. Okay? Very important to absorb this vitamin type. The other critical cell here are the chief cells. Chief cells. And they're the ones that are in the purple here. These chief cells. They're important ultimately because they're going to produce pepsinogen. Okay, pepsinogen. And pepsinogen is the inactive digestive enzyme. So it's the inactive digestive enzyme. We're talking about protein digestive enzymes. So it's inactive pepsinogen, okay, when it's released from the chief cells. The thing about protein digestive enzymes is they all start in an inactive state. They have to be triggered, activated. When it comes to overall digestive enzymes that are carbohydrate digestive enzymes or fat digestive enzymes or nucleic digestive enzymes, they're already active. They can already start catabolically breaking down food. But proteins always need something to trigger them. And the case being here for pepsinogen, the trigger is the interaction of hydrochloric acid. Okay, so here's pepsinogen. Okay, when hydrochloric acid interacts with pepsinogen, we ultimately then form pepsin. Pepsin is so important. It is the first digestive enzyme that breaks down fats, catabolically breaking down fats. A protein digestive enzyme, it's active. It can start to break down protein, pepsin. So it can break down steak. It can break down fish, hamburger meat, bacon, sausage, etc. Okay? So that's a very important enzyme to know here in the stomach, pepsin. Okay? Very important to remember this, pepsin. Pepsin breaks down proteins. Okay? Pepsin breaks down proteins. So very important here. The other digestive enzyme that's actually going to be released from the gastric glands is gastric lipase, and that's not specified here, but gastric lipase. So gastric lipase, and you can imagine this enzyme, gastric lipase. Lipase, remember, is referring to breaking down of fats. So gastric lipase is all about breaking down of fats. Okay, moving on. Another type of cell that's important to know here are the enteroendocrine cells. They ultimately release hormones. So here are several to be aware of. Histamine. This hormone, histamine, is important. This hormone will interact with the parietal cells we've talked about to actually release the hydrochloric acid. Gastrin, I mentioned that towards the beginning of lecture. Gastrin, this hormone, is released from these cells, which leads to an increase in hydrochloric acid secretion. So this is really playing a big role early on in digestion, releasing that hydrochloric acid within the gastric juice, and hence the noises you hear of your stomach. So the expression of, "Mommy, my tummy's talking to me." So something along those lines. And then two other hormones we're going to get into a little later here, serotonin and somatostatin, which are two other critical hormones that are being produced in these endocrine cells in the gastric gland. All right, briefly we're going to talk about ulcers. How can we not when we talk about the stomach? So, peptic ulcers. Ulcers affect about 1 out of 8 Americans, and typically between 50 to 70. So you could say maybe per se the start of middle age. And the majority of ulcers, you can see 90% are caused by bacteria. And the bacteria type here is H. pylori. That's the species. It's all of this bacteria here, H. pylori. It's acid resistant. So typically what really brings on the bacteria to start deteriorating the walls of the stomach or even the small intestine is a suppressed immune system. When someone's immune system is suppressed, maybe significant stress, that can really trigger the bacteria to be activated and more active within the stomach. And then you ultimately end up with what you're seeing here in the picture here. The bacteria is so aggressive it can make lesions, holes in the lining of the stomach here, or even the duodenum. Here's a picture of the H. pylori here. The green here represents the bacteria. So here you can see it's in the lining. The bacteria is drilling holes in that mucosa layer of the stomach, acts like a drill bit, making holes. And there's several different types of symptoms that you can have if you're experiencing ulcers. One being abdominal bloating, but along with diarrhea, cramping, those are all possibilities. Vomiting, so a lot of gas problems. A lot of that can be triggered from these ulcers here. Ultimately, the treatment to put these bacteria in check is antibiotics. Antibiotics can be utilized to go after that bacteria. Of course, if you have ulcers, unfortunately, it's a big risk factor for developing stomach cancer. We're now going to take a look at, well, how does this chyme move out of the stomach and move into the small intestine? So there's 3 major movements of the chyme through the stomach. So step 1 is propulsion. So referring to these very strong waves of peristalsis that will move the chyme ultimately from the top of the stomach, known as the fundus, this region up here, and driving the chyme down into the pylorus. So this pyloric region down here of the stomach. So propulsion is the first process here of moving that food towards the pyloric sphincter valve. Propulsion, strong movement of the chyme. Number 2, grinding. This is where we have very strong, vigorous peristalsis occurring and mixing action taking place here of the chyme. And this is right up against the pylorus, so right up against the pyloric sphincter. And then number 3 here, we're looking at what's known as the overall rectal pulsation. And here we have the pyloric end of the stomach. We'll go ahead and we'll deliver just a small amount of chyme to empty into the duodenum. And the rest of the chyme goes backwards in the stomach for more mixing. So we're seeing that here in this picture. here is that kind of the more the darker type of yellow. Pyloric sphincter opens slightly, and a little bit of chyme enters into the small intestine. So with the peristalsis occurring, you can see here there are these peristaltic waves which help to move the chyme at a rate of 3 per minute. So that's the overall rate of the peristaltic waves, 3 per minute, of moving the chyme towards the pyloric sphincter. This pyloric region down here holds approximately about 30 milliliters of chyme. And again, not all the chyme leaves at once. You'll have a little bit, approximate of 3 mils, will empty into the duodenum, while 27 milliliters will continue to be mixed. All right, we're now going to take a look at ultimately 2 more overall hormones that play a very important role with digestion, and the fact eventually that you get full. So you've been eating a lot, you've been enjoying your all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet, and eventually you get to a point where you can't eat anymore. And so there can be signals that can be sent back up to the brain, and overall control of the parasympathetic nervous system goes down, which we can see here, because that, again, really, really controls digestion. So signals going up to the central nervous system, the parasympathetic activity declines, and ultimately sympathetic activity can increase. 2 hormones that can really play a role here. One is what's known as somatostatin. So somatostatin, this hormone here, ultimately inhibits gastric secretion, and by doing so in the stomach, ultimately it's the idea that I'm full. That's that feeling you have, where no longer are you able to eat anymore. And then, of course, what also plays a big role with digestion and eating is this idea of the hormone serotonin. This is considered like the pleasure hormone. Again, you have nerve connections between the stomach and the brain. Serotonin is that really good feeling you have after eating. And serotonin levels can play a big role with appetite and things like that. So you have a high amount of serotonin, a good appetite. Somebody who might be depressed, it's possible that there might be a hormonal imbalance and serotonin levels might be a lot lower. And so there may not be as much of an appetite to eat. So serotonin is extremely important. Sometimes some medication can go ahead and suppress that hormone temporarily. So in order to get the mood of someone depressed more to a mood of happiness. So again, the feeling of feeling amazing after eating, you had a great meal. Oh, that all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet was so good. Or, oh, Olive Garden, oh, so good, so good. Or that Panera bread, oh, so delicious. So important to be aware of these hormones, and really key when we think of the stomach. All right, so time for more review here. So number 6 for review. Blank produce hydrochloric acid and the intrinsic factor. So what cell type would we be referring to here? What cells? What function of cells are we referring to here? Okay, and the correct answer, hopefully you already circled it, but it would be choice letter B. Letter B is the correct answer, the parietal cells. Okay, letter B, parietal cells. And number 7 for review, the enzyme pepsin breaks down what? What nutrient? The enzyme pepsin breaks down what? All right, and I would go with, how about choice letter C, proteins. Proteins, again, are just starting to be broken down in the stomach for the first time because of this critical enzyme, pepsin. So, very good. So this is the end of part 1 of the digestive system notes. And maybe you're hungry, perhaps. So why not have a cheeseburger on the beach with the sun out. Cheeseburger in paradise.